Hello there, this is John Franquez, and here is episode 5 of George Washington, the next episode in our presidential series. Now, in the last episode, the Americans had beat the British Empire. This new American nation had beat the British, and the last major battle was the Battle of Yorktown. However, George Washington had a personal tragedy that he had to deal with, and that was that his stepson John was his name. His stepson John had died. He was 26 years old. How did he die? He went to work with General Washington and he was there at the last battle, the last major battle in Yorktown. He got sick and died. This was the last remaining son of Washington's wife, Martha. John had been married. He was 26. He had 4 children of his own. After he died, 2 of those kids remained with Washington and Martha in Mount Vernon. The other 2 went with their mother, with the widow, who got remarried and had 16 more kids. Outside of that, General Washington's mom, I wanted to mention real quickly, General Washington's mom was a loyalist, and what that means was that she was loyal to Britain. She didn't approve of Washington's revolutionary ways. She was a very demanding, very difficult woman, and he set her up in a house and he took good care of her. She lived to be 80 years old. She died a few months after he became president. Now, very important, after the American Revolution, Washington disbanded the army and he resigned, and this stunned Europe because Washington could have taken his army, taken over, and become the first king of the United States. He chose not to do that. He went over to Mount Vernon, and while he was in Mount Vernon working on his land, riding horses, Washington loved horses. A few facts about him I want to mention. Washington loved children, and you can't picture Washington sitting on the floor playing with kids, but he did this. And one time he went to a house and he went into this room where there were a bunch of kids, and he went to play with them, I guess, and they were intimidated. They were scared of him by this point because this is George Washington here. And he left the room, and what could he do? He had a volcanic temper. His hair, he had a full head of hair that was red most of his life. He never wore wigs. Okay, while he was in Mount Vernon, this new government, they had what they called the Articles of Confederation. It was like the Constitution of that time. This is like an experiment. It was a republic. All over Europe there were monarchies, there were kings and queens. This was a republic, a democratic government. And there were a lot of laws. You had to have 1 representative per state, which some were not happy with because states that had a lot of people, they felt they should get more representation, but that wasn't the case. There was a lot of trouble, though. After the American Revolution, there was a big war debt, and the currency that they were using had dropped in value. Inflation had gone up. In the meantime, the British were at their trading post to the west. They kind of refused to go, even though the treaty said they were supposed to leave. They were still there. The Spanish down in Florida were blocking off the Mississippi and not allowing the Americans to trade. The British, on the other hand, also were blocking the Americans from trading in the West Indies. It was a very, very bad time. There were food riots. There was a depression. There were rebellions. Farmers who could not pay their share of the war debt had their lands seized. The North was also having problems with the South because the North was trying to stop slavery slowly. So they put a big tax on any imported African slave, and the South was angry about that. So the divisions were already starting. Anyway, there was chaos. The Articles of Confederation were not working. They needed to do something new. So they formed what they call the Constitutional Convention. They were going to prepare a new constitution. Now, this is important that rather than go back to having kings and having a monarchy, they decided, no, we're going to push this republic idea as much as possible. So this constitution was going to be formed. These great minds got together, especially the great mind of a man they called Little Jimmy. James Madison. He became later the 4th president of the United States. A lot of the ideas in the Constitution came from him. They call him the father of the Constitution. Also the father of the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was later implemented as 10 amendments to the Constitution. Freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, freedom for me to make this video and not get arrested. All these freedoms that we take for granted today, we should thank them, especially Little Jimmy. But anyway, some of the ideas they had was to divide checks and balances. There were philosophers that said we should have checks and balances, balance power so nobody becomes too powerful. Three branches: executive, judicial, legislative. Executive, a president, they had to choose. Judicial, Supreme Court, and legislative, Congress. Now, Congress was going to have two bodies, Senate and House of Representatives. In the Senate were two representatives for each state. In the House of Representatives, the number of representatives per state depended on the population. You had a big population, you got more representatives. An argument broke out. What about the slaves? Do they count as people to be represented? Some of them said no, this is property. But finally they negotiated and said that each slave counted for 3/5 of a person. Ugh. Anyway, we won't get into that. Let's move on. The capital of the United States was in New York, and the president was going to live there. The South was not very happy about that. They finally negotiated that they were going to move from New York to Philadelphia, and eventually this little district was going to be created that today is Washington, D.C. Okay, they unanimously voted for a person to become president, and that person was George Washington, who by this point did not want to be president. Washington was adored by the public, and he knew that becoming president, he would lose a lot of that. In fact, he would be hated. This actually did happen. There were a lot of people that ended up hating Washington for some ideas. He was kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. You can't please everybody. And he knew this was going to happen. But anyway, he accepted, unanimously was elected. Twice, as I mentioned. 4 months after becoming president, his mother died at the age of 80. He chose a cabinet. In that cabinet was the Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson. These two men hated each other and caused a lot of trouble for Washington, but he did respect their views. And these men hated each other, but it was a hate out of principle, not personal animosity per se. Hamilton believed in a strong central government. Jefferson believed in a weak, strong central government and let each state govern itself to a point. Washington was trying to figure out how could they fix the economy. And Hamilton had an idea. Let's get a national bank. Jefferson opposes. He said no. A national bank would be too powerful and would benefit the wealthy. But Hamilton said we need a national bank, and one of his ideas was for this bank to assume the debt of each state. So instead of them owing money, this national bank in the federal government would pay the debts for these states and collect from them later. This was very good for the states that owed a lot of money, but the states that didn't owe that much didn't feel they should pay more than their fair share. Hamilton also had an idea, let's put a tax on any imported good. And they did this. And 90% of the money that came in the 1790s came from these imported goods. Washington did approve of the National Bank, and it went through. There was a tax on whiskey. And this is kind of funny, but it's important. Because there was a whiskey rebellion. People were using whiskey as money. You could buy land. Here's a barn full of whiskey. Let me buy that piece of land you got over there. Oh, I want to buy that nice lamp. Here's a little gallon of whiskey. People were using whiskey as money, and a tax was placed on it. People were angry, especially in Pennsylvania. They actually formed a militia, a group of people to rebel against this, a little mini revolution. Washington and Hamilton got on their horses, led an army. The only time that a U.S. president has ever done this. They led an army to go there, squash this rebellion, and Washington wanted to show that the new U.S. government would enforce their laws by force if necessary. Washington also signed treaties with the Native Americans. He started looking at the Native Americans as foreign nations. Unfortunately, a lot of settlers that lived in that area did not respect the treaties. The Native Americans struck back. War broke out with the Native Americans. About 1,000 of them died over the next few years, and they ended up losing and surrendering their land. While Washington was trying to establish this new government, the French Revolution broke out there in France. Many Americans said we should go there and help the French because they helped us in our revolution, let's help them in their revolution. But a lot of people were turned off by the French. One of the reasons was that the French tended to be the revolutionaries tended to be very anti-religion. That didn't go well. Also, there was a reign of terror. They were chopping off heads and doing things, and the Americans were turned off. France went to war against Britain. Many Americans, including Thomas Jefferson, said, let's help France. Alexander Hamilton, pressured Washington, said, no, let's help Britain. We got to get them away from us. They're out there on the west. We got to get them to go away. We want to do good trade with them. They can help us. And he felt that Britain would be a better trading partner. Washington used this situation to negotiate with the British. And he got a deal where they did pick up and leave. They stopped blocking the West Indies and they took off. Also, Washington had a treaty signed with the Spanish that allowed the Americans to trade down by the Mississippi. But after all of this, Washington signed the Proclamation of Neutrality, meaning that the United States was not going to get involved in any foreign war. It would not help the British and it would not help the French. Thomas Jefferson was so disgusted by this that he resigned. Okay, let's talk about a few facts about Washington real quickly. Washington never lived in the White House. He's the only U.S. president that never got to live there. Everything was new at the time. And to give a quick example of that, nobody knew how this new government was going to work. Everything Washington did set a precedent of what was going to happen later. Today, a president signs a law, sends it to Congress, and they approve it or disapprove it. Back then, Washington signed a treaty with the Creek Indians. Sorry, before he signed it, he decided to let Congress argue about it and then decide whether to sign it or not. So he went to visit Congress, he sat there and he watched them, and he left very frustrated and very angry at all of their bickering and going back and forth. He never went back again. The Congress even argued about what to call him. They ended up calling him Mr. President. Washington traveled to every state in the United States, which 13 states. That's not a small thing if you consider that this is all on horseback. When he got to Massachusetts, the governor, John Hancock, was the governor, didn't want to go see Washington. He felt that Washington should go to see him because he's the governor of the state and Washington is the president. He's a servant of the people. Washington refused. Instead, he stayed where he was and Hancock relented and went to see him. This was symbolic of the federal government presiding over the state government. When Washington traveled to Connecticut, he didn't travel on Sundays out of respect for the religious people that were there. Washington did not hold very many cabinet meetings. He didn't like meetings. He would write something, give it to a secretary to give to the cabinet members. They were given 5 hours to respond to that, and that was the way he handled this. During these 8 years, he got very sick twice. He could have died. He got pneumonia, got through it. Then he had a growth in his leg. It was a cancerous tumor, and they had to cut it out. And there was no anesthetic back then. They couldn't put you to sleep or anything. Now, I did mention the Bill of Rights gave freedom of the press and freedom of speech. Washington, with age, had become very hypersensitive to criticism. He wasn't used to being criticized before. He was adored. Now, people are saying things about him. He was very heavily attacked by the press, and Washington didn't like it. He pushed on, and he decided to try to fortify the nation as much as possible, finish that second term, and get out. More facts. The first Thanksgiving was celebrated in 1789. There was a census taken to see how many people were in the United States. The population was 4 million. 3 states joined the United States: Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee. The U.S. Navy was established. There was a Naturalization Act. If you lived there as a foreigner in the United States, after 5 years, you can apply for residency. 1796, the first United States passport was given. The first life insurance policy was given around those times. The first elephant to step into the United States arrived in 1796. It came from India. Okay, Washington's second term ends. He was president for 8 years. They asked him to stay for a third. He would have won that election, but he said no. He had had enough. This was a great thing because if Washington had done what like many Latin American presidents in the 20th century that would stay president for 20 or 30 years, they became like kings, like dictators. And this could have happened, but instead Washington set a precedent by leaving after 2 terms, and that allowed the U.S. to fortify. He was buying time to give this new nation to grow. Anyway, after 2 terms, he was out. There was an election. John Adams won against Thomas Jefferson. John Adams won. Back then, whoever came in second became vice president, so Thomas Jefferson became his vice president, which was strange because they were from different parties. But anyway, Washington told John Adams, you got 1 foot in, I got 1 foot out. Let's see who's happiest. 3 years later, Washington in Mount Vernon went out on his horse. It was snowing. It rained. There was hail. He rode around for hours, got sick, went home, went to bed. The next day woke up with a terrible sore throat. But he went out again to mark some trees or something that needed to be cut down. That night, he woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning. He could hardly breathe. His throat was so inflamed. His wife Martha said, "Let me go out and get some help." He said, "No, it's cold outside." He did not want her to go out there. But the next day, 3 doctors were brought in. They started bleeding Washington. Back then, they would bleed you, thinking that if they could bleed out the disease. And they did this to Washington, which made matters worse. He got sicker and sicker. He noticed that the end was coming. He had some papers brought to him that he signed. Little by little, he was losing his speech, and his last words were, "'Tis well." He died. He was 67 years old. This is in 1799. He wanted to reach the 1800s, and he missed it by about 2 weeks. Why did he die? Well, of course, he had an inflamed epilogatus, I believe is a flap behind the throat. It was inflamed. There was an infection. Also, there's a condition called hypovolemia. When they bleed you and you lose too much blood, your blood pressure goes down, your blood plasma goes down, you can have tachycardia, and this, in effect, possibly happened to Washington. After he died, Martha, his wife, burned all his letters, all the correspondence, so we don't have any love letters between them. Europe looked at Washington by this point as a great man, and in France, Napoleon declared 10 days of mourning. Washington's legacy was to help this new nation begin to grow, and he is there on the $1 bill. He's on coin. Almost every country in the world has a street named after him, and he's one of the greatest figures not only in the United States but in world history. So that ends the chapter on George Washington. We're going to come up in the next episode and begin with the second president, John Adams. In the meantime, subscribe and also comment below. This is John Franquist, and have a good day. Thank you.